On December 25th, 2010, in the early hours of Christmas morning, an unsuspecting couple set out for a walk with their dogs through a remote, snow-covered woodland. Suddenly, one of the dogs became agitated. It stopped abruptly, its nose pressed firmly against the snow, sniffing intently at something hidden beneath the white surface. The owners, at first assuming their pet had discovered a buried animal or some discarded object, stepped closer out of curiosity. However, their intrigue quickly turned to horror. As the snow was pushed aside, something unnatural began to emerge, a pale, lifeless limb protruding from the icy ground. Law enforcement officers arrived promptly at the scene. The body, frozen and partially concealed beneath the heavy snowfall, was soon identified as that of Joanna Yates. In this documentary, we will investigate a real crime that happened to Joanna Claire Yates, was born on April 19, 1985, in the picturesque county of Hampshire, England. She was the youngest of two children in the loving and well-respected family of David and Teresa Yates. Her upbringing was filled with warmth, support, and privilege, as both of her parents held high-ranking managerial positions in successful corporations. From an early age, Joanna exhibited remarkable intelligence, creativity, and determination. She was a naturally gifted child with an innate ability to excel academically and artistically. Her parents noticed her exceptional abilities early on and encouraged her to develop them to their fullest potential. Joanna was passionate about nature, aesthetics, and design, which naturally led her to pursue a career in landscape architecture. When the time came to choose a university, she enrolled at the highly regarded University of Essex, where she pursued her studies in landscape design with unwavering enthusiasm and dedication. Joanna had always dreamed of working in a field that allowed her to blend art with functionality, and her natural eye for beauty made her an exceptional designer. She was diligent, meticulous, and always sought perfection in her work. Shortly after obtaining her degree, her talents were recognized by a prestigious design firm that offered her a promising position. Eager to prove herself, Joanna seized the opportunity and quickly rose through the ranks. Her exceptional skills and strong work ethic set her apart from her colleagues, and within a few years, she had earned the title of department head, a remarkable feat for someone so young. In 2008, while working at the firm, Joanna met Greg Reardon, a talented and ambitious engineer who was just 2 years her senior. Greg was intelligent, driven, and shared many of Joanna's aspirations. Their connection was instantaneous, and their relationship blossomed rapidly. They complemented each other perfectly, balancing their careers with their growing love for one another. Within a year of dating, they made the decision to move in together, renting a cozy apartment where they could build their future. Though they deeply loved each other, they chose not to rush into marriage. Instead, they focused on their professional growth and financial stability, setting aside savings for their future wedding and the home they dreamed of owning. Everything seemed to be falling into place for the couple. Their relationship was strong, their careers were flourishing, and they had a bright future ahead. So, when Joanna received an enticing job offer in the autumn of 2010 from a top-tier construction and design firm in Bristol, she saw it as an incredible opportunity. Without hesitation, she accepted the position, and together with Greg, they began preparing for their big move. Greg, who worked for a large engineering company, was able to transfer to a different branch in Bristol, allowing them to continue their lives together seamlessly. By mid-October 2010, Joanna and Greg settled into their new home, a charming ground-floor apartment in a 2-story house situated in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Bristol. The property belonged to Christopher Jeff, the landlord who lived on the upper floor, while another young couple had recently moved into the second ground-floor unit. The neighborhood had an air of safety and tranquility, making it the ideal place for the couple to begin this new chapter in their lives. By mid-December, they were eagerly preparing to celebrate their first Christmas in Bristol. They decorated their home with festive lights, put up a beautifully adorned Christmas tree, and meticulously wrapped gifts for their loved ones. Every evening, they would sit together, writing heartfelt holiday cards to their families and friends, dreaming about the wonderful life they were building together. On Friday, December 17, 2010, Greg packed his bags and left for Sheffield to spend the weekend with his parents. Joanna, who had commitments in Bristol, decided to stay behind. She had made plans to meet her friends and colleagues for a night out, celebrating the approaching holidays before dedicating the rest of the weekend to finishing Christmas preparations. She had also promised Greg that she would prepare a romantic dinner for his return, looking forward to their quiet evening together before the holiday rush. The evening unfolded exactly as she had envisioned. Joanna met her friends at a lively bar where they enjoyed drinks, danced, and shared stories about their holiday plans. Laughter filled the air as they celebrated the festive season, making memories that Joanna had looked forward to for weeks. At around 8 p.m., she bid farewell to her friends, mentioning that she planned to stop at a store to pick up some food before heading home. She called Greg to let him know that she was on her way back and promised to text him before going to bed. That was the last time anyone heard from her. Over the weekend, Greg tried reaching out to Joanna multiple times, but his calls and messages went unanswered. Initially, he brushed it off, assuming she was busy with holiday preparations or experiencing occasional network issues in their area. However, as the hours passed with no response, his concern grew. When Greg finally arrived home late that evening, he was immediately struck by an overwhelming sense of unease. The first thing he noticed was that their front door was unlocked, a detail that sent a shiver down his spine. Second, Joanna herself was nowhere to be found, even though her purse, keys, and wallet were in their usual places. Her cell phone, which Greg called in a desperate attempt to reach her, suddenly rang from the couch in their living room. It was lying there, untouched, as though she had left it behind without a second thought. Their pet cat, normally well-fed and active, appeared extremely hungry, meowing loudly, suggesting that it hadn't been fed in days. Her car remained parked in the garage, and her winter coat and boots, the ones she would never leave without, were still hanging by the entrance. The situation was completely baffling. How could Joanna have disappeared without taking her essential belongings, especially in the dead of winter when temperatures had plummeted and heavy snowfall blanketed the city? Realizing something was terribly wrong, Greg immediately contacted the police. Given the circumstances, an unlocked door, untouched valuables, and no communication for over 48 hours, law enforcement took the case seriously and launched a full-scale investigation. Detectives began by reconstructing Joanna's last known movements, piecing together a timeline from witness accounts and surveillance footage. The bar, situated about a 20-minute drive from her apartment, was a familiar and safe place. Security cameras showed Joanna leaving around 8:30 p.m., heading toward her car, alone. On her way home, she stopped by a nearby supermarket, purchasing a pre-made pizza and 2 bottles of beer, her usual choice for a relaxing evening. The receipt found in her apartment confirmed the transaction time. Joanna arrived home around 9 p.m. and briefly exchanged messages with a few friends regarding an upcoming Christmas party. She preheated the oven, placed the pizza inside, set out a plate, and placed the beer on the table. One of the bottles had been opened, though barely touched, with just a couple of sips missing. The kitchen scene suggested that she had been preparing to sit down for a quiet meal when something interrupted her. What could have happened in that moment? Detectives carefully combed through the apartment for any signs of forced entry, yet nothing indicated a break-in. No windows were shattered, no locks were tampered with, and there were no immediate signs of struggle. More notably, there was no blood, no overturned furniture, and no indication that someone had ransacked the place. It was as if Joanna had simply vanished into thin air. The police ruled out robbery as a motive. Her cash, bank cards, and valuable possessions remained untouched. This pointed to a far more chilling possibility. She may have been taken by someone she trusted enough to willingly let inside. The lack of any obvious struggle puzzled investigators, but another strange detail emerged. While the beer remained on the table, the pizza was missing entirely. There was no trace of it in the apartment, no empty box in the trash, no half-eaten leftovers in the fridge. Yet the plate, utensils, and neatly placed napkins suggested she had been just about to eat. Where had the pizza gone? Had she actually started eating only to be interrupted? The search for Joanna escalated on Monday, December 20th. Teams of officers scoured the surrounding areas, knocking on doors, questioning neighbors, and reviewing hours of surveillance footage. Despite their best efforts, no significant leads emerged. There were no ransom demands, no suspicious activity detected near her home, and no clear explanation for her sudden disappearance. As time passed without any sign of Joanna, investigators feared the worst. On Tuesday, her distraught parents, brother, and boyfriend made a public appeal on television, pleading for any information that could lead to her whereabouts. A reward of £10,000 sterling was initially offered for credible tips, and within days, it was raised to £50,000 sterling in a desperate bid to incentivize the public's cooperation. Despite these efforts, no credible leads materialized, and the investigation stalled. The case had officially turned into a terrifying mystery. Determined to find answers, police meticulously retraced Joanna's drive home from the bar. They reviewed street cameras along her route, confirming that no other vehicle had followed her and that she had driven straight home without making any unexplained stops. There was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted on the way. With no immediate suspects and no clear motive, detectives turned their focus to Joanna's inner circle, scrutinizing her relationships and daily interactions. Did she have conflicts with anyone? Was there a hidden dispute, a jealous acquaintance, or an unknown enemy? However, their search revealed nothing alarming. Joanna was well-liked and respected both at work and in her social circles. There was no history of threats, no troubled relationships, and no known enemies. She had never expressed fear or concerns about anyone. As is standard in cases of unexplained disappearances, the police had to consider the possibility that her boyfriend, Greg Reardon, might be involved. Despite his apparent distress, he became the primary person of interest. Investigators probed every detail of Greg's life, searching for inconsistencies or potential motives. After all, a trip to another city could have served as a convenient cover, providing an alibi while masking sinister intentions. However, investigators were soon able to confirm that Greg Reardon had worked a full day on Friday before leaving Bristol and driving straight to his parents' home in Sheffield. Along the way, he stopped at a gas station on the highway, where a receipt timestamped at 9 p.m. indicated that he was already nearing his destination at that time. By 9:30 p.m., he had arrived at his family's house, as corroborated by his parents and siblings, all of whom stated that he did not leave the house at any point during the weekend. Further evidence bolstered Greg's alibi. Phone records showed that he had made numerous attempts to contact Joanna over the course of the weekend, placing dozens of calls and sending multiple text and voice messages, none of which received a reply. Additionally, traffic and surveillance footage confirmed his journey and whereabouts. After thoroughly verifying all evidence, investigators determined that Greg could not have returned to Bristol without detection. As a result, he was formally cleared of suspicion and removed from the list of potential suspects. On December 25, 2010, 8 days after Joanna's disappearance, the case took a grim and shocking turn. Early that Christmas morning, a couple was walking their dogs through a remote, snow-covered woodland about 3 miles from Joanna's apartment when one of the dogs began sniffing and frantically digging at something beneath the snow. The owners, curious and alarmed, approached the area only to recoil in horror upon realizing that their pet had uncovered what appeared to be a human leg protruding from the snowdrift. Trembling with fear, they immediately contacted the police. Responding officers arrived swiftly, securing the area and beginning the painstaking task of uncovering the snow-covered remains. As they carefully removed layers of ice and debris, they uncovered the body of a young woman, partially buried beneath a mixture of branches, leaves, and thick snow. The freezing temperatures had preserved the remains remarkably well, preventing decomposition despite the body being left exposed for days. Authorities quickly identified the victim as Joanna Yates, a devastating confirmation for her grieving family and friends. A forensic examination revealed harrowing details of the brutal crime. Joanna had sustained over 40 separate injuries, including extensive bruising, multiple lacerations, and defensive wounds on her arms and hands, clear indicators that she had fought desperately to defend herself. In addition, her ribs had been broken, her nose fractured, and deep pressure marks were found around her neck. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation, suggesting that she had been overpowered and suffocated by her attacker. Strangely, an autopsy revealed that despite buying a pizza before returning home, no food was found in Joanna's stomach, suggesting she had never had the chance to eat before the attack. This chilling revelation led investigators to conclude that the crime had not occurred in her apartment but elsewhere, and that her body had later been transported to the remote wooded area in an attempt to cover up evidence. The killer had made a crude effort to conceal the remains by covering them with branches and foliage. However, an intense snowstorm in the following days buried the body under a thick layer of snow, inadvertently delaying its discovery for over a week. Despite the area being frequented by joggers and dog walkers, it had remained hidden from view. Joanna was found wearing the same outfit she had been seen in at the bar on the night of her disappearance. Her coat, however, was missing. Investigators noted another unusual detail. Joanna, who often wore knitted socks instead of slippers at home, had only one sock remaining on her foot. The other sock was missing and was not found either at the crime scene or in her apartment. This raised a disturbing possibility. The killer might have taken it as a trophy, a behavior commonly observed among repeat offenders with violent patterns. With the discovery of Joanna's remains, the nature of the investigation shifted dramatically. What had begun as a missing person case was now officially classified as a homicide. A full-scale operation was launched, involving some of the nation's most experienced forensic experts, many of whom were brought in from London. Despite their best efforts, detectives initially struggled to generate significant leads. Interviews with neighbors in Joanna's building yielded little valuable information, as no one reported seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary on the night of her disappearance. There were no apparent signs of forced entry in her apartment, and surveillance footage showed no suspicious individuals lingering outside her home. Investigators turned their attention to Joanna's immediate surroundings, examining those who lived in close proximity to her. On the ground floor of the same building where she lived, another unit was rented by 32-year-old engineer Vincent Tabak and his fiancée, 28-year-old Tanya. The couple had moved into the apartment a few months earlier and, on the surface, appeared to be a quiet, unassuming pair. Vincent Tabak claimed that he barely knew Joanna, stating that they had only exchanged pleasantries a handful of times since she and Greg had moved into the building. On that fateful Friday evening, Vincent Tabak also claimed that he had been at home resting and did not leave the house until Tanya called him, requesting a ride home from the Christmas party. He maintained that he had spent most of the evening alone, watching television and browsing the internet, only stepping out briefly to purchase some items from a nearby store before later driving to pick up his fiancée. Across the street from Joanna's apartment, a lively house party was in full swing that evening, with loud music reverberating through the neighborhood and a crowd of guests drinking heavily. Some of the partygoers admitted to being too intoxicated to recall any specific details about the surrounding area that night. However, at approximately 9:30 p.m., a few individuals who had stepped onto the balcony to smoke reported hearing a woman scream. The sound was brief, quickly fading into the night, and they dismissed it as an unremarkable incident, attributing it to the usual background noise of a busy residential area. As the investigation progressed, detectives soon turned their attention to 63-year-old Christopher Jeff, the landlord who owned the building where Joanna and Greg resided. Jeff, a retired schoolteacher, had lived alone for several years. Neighbors described him as eccentric but harmless. A well-read, intelligent man with peculiar mannerisms and an old-fashioned sense of dress. His long white hair and sometimes reclusive lifestyle had made him an enigmatic figure in the community. Some found him odd, but few could imagine him being involved in a violent crime. When police brought Jeff in for a questioning, he appeared noticeably anxious, though he willingly cooperated with investigators. He reiterated that on the night of Joanna's disappearance, he had gone to the gym as part of his routine, a habit he maintained 3 times a week. According to his account, he returned home around 9 p.m., locked his door, and went to bed shortly after. He insisted that he had heard and seen nothing unusual that night, nor had he left his apartment until the following morning. However, his alibi was uncorroborated. No one could confirm whether he had truly remained in his apartment as he claimed. As detectives pressed him for more details, Jeff hesitated before suddenly recalling a detail he had previously omitted. He claimed that as he returned from the gym that night, he noticed 3 unfamiliar young men lingering near the property. He stated that he had never seen them before and did not pay much attention to them at the time. However, when asked for a description of these men, Jeff was vague, explaining that it had been too dark to see them clearly. Investigators found this sudden addition to his account suspicious, as it seemed to emerge only under pressure. Meanwhile, Vincent Tabak, who occupied the other ground floor apartment with Tanya, told detectives that he had left the house twice that night, once around 9 p.m. to visit a store, and later at 2 a.m. to pick Tanya up from her party. In his statement, he recalled that when he first left at 9 p.m., Jeff's car was parked in its usual position in the driveway. However, upon returning at 2 a.m., He noticed that the car was still in the driveway but was now facing the opposite direction, as though it had been moved during the night. This directly contradicted Jeff's claim that he had not left his home, raising further suspicion. Greg, the victim's boyfriend, also provided investigators with a potentially significant detail. On the morning of December 17th, just before he departed for the weekend, he had a brief conversation with Jeff. During their exchange, Greg had mentioned that he would be away for a few days and that Joanna would be home alone. If Jeff had been aware of this, it raised questions about whether Joanna's vulnerability had played a role in the tragic events that followed. As the case gained widespread media attention, information about law enforcement's focus on Christopher Jeff was leaked to the press. The revelation that a retired schoolteacher had become a person of interest in the high-profile murder case caused a sensationalist frenzy. Within hours, tabloids began publishing lurid, unfounded speculations about Jeff's past, suggesting, without evidence, that he had a history of inappropriate behavior during his teaching career. Though these allegations were entirely baseless, they took on a life of their own. Public perception began shifting against Jeff, despite the lack of concrete evidence linking him to the crime. In a matter of days, the media coverage spiraled into hysteria. News outlets bombarded Jeff's neighborhood, camping outside his home and hounding him with intrusive questions. Neighbors, who had once viewed him as a harmless eccentric, now eyed him with suspicion. Some members of the public, inflamed by misleading reports, began making aggressive demands for his arrest. By late December, Jeff's life had unraveled. He could no longer step outside without being confronted by hostile reporters and enraged locals, some of whom seemed eager to take justice into their own hands. The overwhelming pressure mounted on law enforcement, and on December 30th, the police arrested Christopher Jeff and conducted a thorough search of his home. The retired teacher continued to assert his innocence, insisting he had no involvement in the crime. During the meticulous search of Christopher Jeff's home, police discovered a pair of shoes with unusual brown stains. Given the nature of the investigation, the shoes were immediately sent to a forensic lab for analysis. Investigators also took a DNA sample from Jeff to compare with the biological material recovered from Joanna's body and clothing. As speculation mounted, the results from the lab finally arrived. To Jeff's relief, the stains on the shoes turned out to be nothing more than ordinary dirt, and his DNA did not match any of the forensic evidence connected to the crime. With no tangible link between Jeff and the murder, law enforcement had no choice but to release him from custody. Despite his official exoneration, the damage had already been done. The relentless media scrutiny did not abate, and the public, already swayed by weeks of sensationalized reporting, found it difficult to separate facts from conjecture. The headlines, once eager to paint him as a sinister figure, now treated his release with skepticism, and the stigma of suspicion continued to shadow his daily life. Jeff, once a quiet and respected educator, had become a pariah in his own community. With Jeff ruled out as a suspect, the investigation took a sharp turn toward another person of interest, Vincent Tabak, Joanna's neighbor. Until this point, Tabak had only been considered a witness, but inconsistencies in his statements began to raise concerns. Detectives noticed that he had gone out of his way to subtly shift suspicion toward Jeff during questioning. More concerning was the faint, healing scratches on his neck, which he failed to provide a clear explanation for. When asked about his relationship with Joanna, he downplayed their interactions, insisting that he hardly knew her. However, investigators found his responses evasive and suspicious. At this stage, police requested a DNA sample from Tabak. Almost immediately, he became visibly anxious, attempting to refuse the request. He offered an unusual explanation, claiming that he had entered Joanna's apartment while it was unoccupied and may have inadvertently left traces of himself there. His resistance only deepened detectives' suspicions. The DNA test proceeded, and when the results came back, forensic analysts found a partial match to the degraded biological material recovered from Joanna's body. While the result was incomplete due to prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures and possible contamination, it was a pivotal moment in the case. This revelation fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Vincent Tabak was no longer just a witness. He became the primary suspect. Although the DNA match was not absolute, it provided enough evidence to justify his immediate arrest. On January 11, 2011, police took Tabak into custody and launched an exhaustive search of his apartment, vehicle, and electronic devices. The findings would soon paint a dark and disturbing picture of the man they were dealing with. Although Tabak had no prior criminal record and had maintained an unassuming lifestyle, investigators uncovered evidence that suggested a deeply troubling side to his personality. His personal and professional acquaintances described him as quiet, polite, and highly intelligent. He was engaged to be married, had a promising career as an engineer, and did not exhibit any outwardly aggressive tendencies. However, as police delved into his private life, they discovered shocking evidence that would shatter the image of the mild-mannered professional. Inside Tabak's car, forensic experts detected a strong odor of cleaning agents, signaling an attempt to meticulously scrub the interior. However, despite his efforts, he had failed to erase all traces of incriminating evidence. Underneath the trunk lining, investigators found small drops of blood, which DNA testing confirmed belonged to Joanna. Additionally, fibers from Joanna's clothing were found embedded in the car's fabric. These discoveries indicated that her body had been transported in his vehicle, contradicting his previous claims of having no involvement in her disappearance. More disturbing revelations emerged when detectives examined Tabak's laptop. A deep forensic search exposed a collection of highly graphic, violent material that depicted extreme mistreatment of women. His browsing history showed an escalating pattern of searches related to violent fantasies and criminal behavior. He had actively sought out content that revolved around non-consensual encounters, and investigators believed that his obsession had taken a sinister turn when he encountered Joanna that night. In addition, records revealed that Tabak had been closely following every detail of the Yates case. He obsessively read news articles, monitored the police's progress, and even engaged in online discussions regarding possible suspects, going so far as to subtly direct attention toward Jeff. 2 days after his arrest, on January 13, Tabak was formally charged with first-degree homicide. The overwhelming accumulation of evidence had cornered him, and realizing that denial was futile, he changed his approach. Instead of outright denial, he offered his own version of events, attempting to minimize his culpability. According to Tabak, he had been returning home from the store when he noticed Joanna through her window. He claimed that she had smiled and waved at him, inviting him inside. Once in her apartment, he alleged that she made an intimate advance, which he responded to enthusiastically. However, he stated that when she abruptly changed her mind and began screaming, he panicked. Vincent Tabak initially alleged that he had instinctively covered Joanna Yates's mouth in a desperate attempt to silence her, fearing that her screams would attract the attention of nearby neighbors. He claimed that he held his hand over her mouth for no more than 30 seconds, and when he finally let go, he realized she was no longer breathing. He explained that his only objective thereafter was to conceal what had happened, which led him to dispose of her body in an act of fear rather than premeditation. However, Tabak's narrative was riddled with inconsistencies and failed to explain the severity of the injuries found on Joanna's body. In addition to being strangled, Joanna had suffered broken ribs, bruises, and other injuries that suggested she had been overpowered with considerable force. Furthermore, the blood evidence found in the trunk of Tabak's car contradicted his claim of panic-fueled disposal. If the killing had been accidental, why was there evidence of blood in a location that indicated transportation? Investigators quickly dismissed Tabak's version of events and, instead, proposed a far more sinister scenario. They theorized that Vincent Tabak had developed an unhealthy and secretive fixation on Joanna. They speculated that he had been watching her closely for some time, waiting for the right opportunity to act on his dark impulses. He was fully aware that she would be alone for the weekend, having overheard part of a conversation between Greg and Christopher Jeff that morning. On the night of the crime, Tabak allegedly observed Joanna returning home and, seizing the opportunity, approached her door under false pretenses. He convinced her to let him inside, likely by feigning friendliness or requesting help with something trivial. Once inside, however, his demeanor shifted. Investigators believed that he initiated unwanted advances, which were immediately rebuffed. When Joanna resisted, Tabak became violent, pinning her down with his full weight and crushing her ribcage. The brutality of the attack rendered Joanna incapable of defending herself or calling for help. Vincent Tabak's trial commenced in October 2011, capturing nationwide attention. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Tabak opted to represent himself in court, declining any legal representation. He maintained his claim that Joanna's death had been accidental, hoping to convince the jury to grant him leniency in sentencing. However, prosecutors presented a compelling case against him, laying out the forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and his own suspicious behaviors leading up to and after the crime. The jury was unconvinced by his attempts to downplay the severity of his actions. On October 28, 2011, Vincent Tabak was found guilty of first-degree homicide. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving a minimum of 20 years. However, as further investigations into his personal life continued, an additional year was later added to his sentence due to his possession of unlawful images and videos, which further cemented his profile as a deeply disturbed individual.